I was cleaning my garage when a police officer knocked on my door. "Ma'am, your husband was in a fatal car accident an hour ago." It was impossible. "No, he's upstairs asleep." The officer looked confused. I led him upstairs to our bedroom. The officer drew his weapon. "Ma'am," he said, "step away from him." That isn't. Hello everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. Before I begin my story, I'd love to know which city you're joining us from. Please feel free to share in the comments. So there I was, elbow deep in the greasy guts of my '72 Chevelle. The garage was my sanctuary, the one place in the world where everything made sense. The scent of oil and gasoline was like aromatherapy to me. That car was my dad's, and every time I managed to coax its old, stubborn engine back to life, it felt like I was keeping a piece of him with me. The engine had been giving me grief all week, sputtering and coughing like an old man after a long flight of stairs. But that's the thing about car problems, isn't it? They're honest. They tell you exactly what's wrong. You diagnose the issue, you find the right part, you put in the work, and boom, problem solved. If only life and marriage worked that way. Just that morning, things had been tense. I remember coming into the kitchen for coffee. Gregory was already there, hunched over his phone at the table, his thumb scrolling furiously. "Morning, honey," I'd said, trying to keep my voice light. He'd mumbled, not looking up. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. It had been like that for months. A chill had settled over our house, a quiet distance that felt more profound than any loud argument. He was there, but he wasn't. "Anything interesting?" I'd asked, nodding toward his phone. He finally looked up, his eyes irritated. "Just work, Carol. It's always just work." He snapped the phone face down on the table as if to prove a point. The gesture felt more secretive than reassuring. Later, he'd claimed a migraine was coming on and retreated to the bedroom. I didn't question it. It was easier not to. So, I escaped to the garage. The radio was blasting some Creedence Clearwater Revival, Fortunate Son, the kind of music that made me feel younger than my 54 years. And I was actually enjoying myself, for once. No office politics, no client deadlines, no Gregory making me feel like a stranger in my own home. Just me, my tools, and the satisfying clink of a wrench tightening a bolt. Call it therapy for gals who refuse to admit they need therapy. Then came the knock. It wasn't the friendly, "Hey neighbor, got a cup of sugar?" kind of knock. This was the official, "Your life's about to get royally screwed" variety. 3 sharp, authoritative raps that cut through the music like a knife. I let out an annoyed sigh, wiped my greasy hands on an old rag that had seen better decades, and trudged to the door. I was expecting a salesperson or a local kid raising funds for their soccer team. But it wasn't a kid. It was a police officer. He was young, couldn't have been more than 30, with a fresh face that looked like it should be at a college football game, not delivering life-altering news. He looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He was carrying the kind of heavy stillness that only comes with bad news. His uniform was damp from the October rain that had been drizzling all day, and he held his hat in his hands like he was at a funeral. Which, as it turned out, he basically was. "Ma'am," he started, his voice gentle but firm. "Cops don't show up at your door on a Saturday to tell you you've won the lottery." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. "Are you Carolyn Pierce?" "Depends who's asking," I shot back, a nervous habit. "But yeah, that's me." "What's this about, officer?" He cleared his throat, his gaze unwavering. They must teach them that look at the academy. It was somewhere between sympathetic and professional, like he was trying to be human while still doing a terrible job. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I have some difficult news." He took a breath that seemed to last a year. "Your husband, Gregory Pierce, was involved in a fatal car accident approximately an hour ago." The words didn't just hit me, they went through me, turning everything inside to ice. Fatal accident. Gregory. My brain tried to process it, but the pieces wouldn't fit. It felt like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube in the dark. For a moment, the world went completely silent, except for the sound of the rain and my own heartbeat pounding a frantic rhythm in my ears. Then I did something that probably seemed completely insane. I laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a bitter, choked bark of disbelief that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me, the place where reality had just been shattered. No, I said, shaking my head so hard my hair whipped across my face. No, that's impossible. You've got the wrong guy, wrong house, wrong universe, maybe. I pointed a greasy finger up the stairs. Gregory's upstairs asleep. He's been battling a migraine all day and went to bed early. The look that spread across the young officer's face wasn't what I expected. I was ready for him to be patient, to gently explain that denial is a normal stage of grief. But this was different. This wasn't the look of a cop dealing with a grieving widow. This was pure, unadulterated, what the hell is this woman talking about, confusion. It was the look of a man whose well-rehearsed script had just been thrown out the window. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his voice laced with caution, like he was talking to someone who might suddenly snap. "We have positive identification. The vehicle was registered to Gregory Pierce at this address. We found his wallet in the vehicle. His driver's license, credit cards, they're all his." "Then you found the wrong wallet," I insisted, a wave of stubborn certainty washing over me. This was a mistake. A horrible, terrible mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. I was going to fix it. I was going to march up those stairs and wake Gregory up, and this whole nightmare would be over. I was already heading for the staircase. "Come on, I'll show you." He's right upstairs, probably annoyed that we're making so much noise. The walk up the stairs felt strangely long, each step a lifetime. I could hear the officer's heavy boots behind me, the soft squish of his damp soles on the hardwood. I passed the gallery of photos on the wall, our wedding picture, 22 years ago, both of us so young and foolishly happy. Pictures of our daughter, Layla, from a baby to her high school graduation last year. A whole life, captured in silver frames, a life I was now being told had just ended. Impossible, I thought. I remember hearing the third step creak, the one I always told Gregory we needed to fix. The officer's hand moved almost imperceptibly to rest on the butt of his service weapon. My brain registered the movement, but I was too focused on my mission, too intent on proving him wrong. "Greg, honey!" I called out as we reached the top of the landing, my voice echoing in the quiet hallway. It sounded falsely cheerful even to my own ears. "There's an officer here who thinks you're dead. Come tell this nice young man how very much alive you are." I pushed open the bedroom door with the swagger of a woman who was absolutely certain she was about to receive a massive apology. The room was dark and cool, the heavy blackout curtains drawn against the gray afternoon. I could see the familiar shape under the covers, the slight rise and fall of the blanket in the dim light. Dark hair was fanned across the pillow, just like always. My husband, my Gregory, exactly where I'd left him. A wave of relief washed over me. "See?" I said triumphantly, my voice brimming with a smug "I told you so" tone. My hand reached for the familiar brass knob on the bedside lamp. One very much alive husband. The light clicked on, flooding the room in a warm, yellow glow. And Officer Jackson's entire body went rigid. His hand didn't just move to his gun, it drew it with a clean, terrifyingly fast motion that spoke of years of training and muscle memory. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was a blade. It had gone from sympathetic to deadly serious in the space of a heartbeat. "Step away from the bed. Now." "What? Why?" The words caught in my throat. My brain was lagging behind my eyes. It saw the scene, but it couldn't comprehend it. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. The hair was right. The pajamas he was wearing were his favorite worn-out flannel ones, the ones with a small hole in the collar. But there was something profoundly off about the way the body lay there. Too still. Too perfect. The skin under the lamplight had a strange, unnatural sheen, like cheap wax. "That isn't a person, Mrs. Pierce," Jackson said, his weapon now partially raised, his eyes scanning the room. "That's a mannequin." My stomach dropped, and the world tilted on its axis. A mannequin? I took a stumbling step closer, my mind screaming no, no, no. It wasn't just any mannequin. It was a horrifyingly detailed replica of my husband. I could see the faint, silvery scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a childhood bicycle accident. I could see the tiny mole next to his ear. Someone had gone to incredible, painstaking, and utterly sick lengths to create this thing. It was wearing his clothes, his wedding ring was on its waxy finger, and it was positioned in our bed like a grotesque effigy. For a moment that felt like a century, I just stood there, staring at the thing that had fooled me completely, the faint, familiar scent of his aftershave on the pillow suddenly making me want to vomit. The hours that followed were a disorienting blur of flashing red and blue lights painting streaks across my living room walls. The quiet of my suburban street was shattered by the crackle of police radios and the murmur of curious neighbors gathering on their lawns. My home, my sanctuary, was no longer my own. It was a crime scene. Strangers in latex gloves and paper booties walked through my life, dusting for fingerprints, bagging up items I considered personal, now labeled as evidence. I was sitting at my own kitchen table, a scratchy wool blanket someone had draped over my shoulders feeling more like a cage than a comfort. A stern-looking detective named Wallace, whose face seemed permanently etched with disappointment in the human race, was asking me questions. His partner, a younger, quieter man, just watched, his eyes missing nothing. "Mrs. Pierce, when was the last time you saw your husband?" Detective Wallace asked again, his pen poised over a small notebook. I tried to focus, to push through the fog of shock. "This morning," I repeated, feeling like a broken record. "He said he had a migraine. He went to lie down around 10:30. And you were in the garage the whole time? From 10:30 until the officer arrived?" "Yes," I said. "I was working on my car. The radio was on. I didn't hear anything." He made a note. "And you didn't think it was strange? That your husband was in bed with a mannequin?" The question was so absurd, so utterly insane, that I almost laughed again. Of course I didn't know. I thought it was him. Who on earth would think to check if their sleeping husband was secretly a department store dummy? He ignored my sarcasm. "You and your husband, were you having any problems? Financial troubles? Anyone who might want to hurt either of you?" He was asking about our finances, our life insurance, our will. The standard questions, I suppose, but they felt like accusations. I thought about the coldness that had crept into our marriage, the silences that had grown longer and longer. But that was just life, wasn't it? The slow fade of passion into comfortable, boring routine. It wasn't grounds for whatever this was. "We had our issues," I said, choosing my words carefully. What couple doesn't after 22 years? But nothing that would lead to this. Just then, my neighbor from across the street, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose main hobby was curtain twitching, appeared at my back door holding a casserole dish. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, her eyes wide with a ghoulish mix of pity and morbid curiosity. "I saw the police cars and just had to come over. Is there anything I can do?" She was looking past me, trying to get a glimpse of the investigators inside. The whole neighborhood would be buzzing about this for months. Carolyn Pierce, the crazy lady whose husband died but was also a mannequin. It sounded like the setup to a really twisted joke. After what felt like an eternity of questions and veiled suspicions, they finally told me I had to leave. I couldn't stay in the house. I drove aimlessly through the rain-slicked streets, the windshield wipers keeping a hypnotic, rhythmic beat against the chaos in my head. I ended up at a sterile Holiday Inn on the highway. The room was beige and impersonal, smelling of industrial disinfectant. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed and stared at the water-stained ceiling, replaying the day's events. The mannequin. So perfectly placed. So detailed. This wasn't a random act. This was planned. Someone knew our house, our routines. Someone knew Gregory well enough to replicate that scar over his eye. And then I thought of Brenda. Brenda Vance, my business partner. My supposed best friend. She'd been over for dinner just last week, full of praise for Gregory's new promotion at work. She'd been spending an awful lot of time at our house lately, always with some excuse about work projects. Brenda, who knew our schedules inside and out. A cold dread, colder than the cheap air conditioning in that hotel room, began to settle in my gut. This was personal. For 3 days, I was a ghost haunting room 214 of the Holiday Inn. I'd order food from the diner next door, only to stare at it until it got cold. I'd turn on the TV and see my own house on the local news, the reporter standing in the rain talking about the mysterious mannequin case that had baffled police. I felt like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. The police called twice, asking me to come in for more questioning. Their tone was professional, but the implication was clear: I was their only suspect. The grieving widow is always the first suspect, right? Especially when the circumstances are this bizarre. I was alone, trapped in a nightmare, with no one to turn to. My friends called, but what could I say? Yes, my husband is dead, but also, there's a life-size doll of him in my bed, and no, I have no idea why. They wouldn't understand. I needed help. Not just a lawyer to fend off the police, but someone who would believe me. Someone who knew how to dig for the truth in a mountain of lies. There was only one person. My little sister, Diane. Diane and I were like oil and water. I built my life on stability and rules, she thrived in chaos. After washing out of law school, claiming it was too boring, she'd become a private investigator. She was brilliant, tenacious, and had a healthy disrespect for authority. We hadn't talked much lately. Our last conversation had ended with her telling me I was drowning in suburban mediocrity and needed to wake up. Prophetic, wasn't it? My hand was shaking as I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and alert. Carol? Diane, I need you, I whispered, and then the dam broke. I told her everything, the words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and confusion. The cop, the mannequin, the questions, the hotel room that smelled like broken dreams. I told her about Gregory's strange behavior for the past few months, and my gnawing, gut-wrenching suspicion about Brenda. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. She wasn't judging. She was analyzing. And you never thought to, I don't know, ask him about any of this? Diane's tone had that familiar edge of little sister superiority, but for once, I was grateful for it. I'm not the jealous type, Diane, I said defensively, the same lame excuse I'd given the police. I trusted him. We've been married for 22 years. Carol, she said, and I could hear her sigh through the phone. You're not the jealous type, you're the oblivious type. There's a difference. She didn't say it cruelly, just as a statement of fact. All right. Stay put. Don't talk to the police again without a lawyer. Don't talk to anyone. I'm on my way. I'll be there in 3 hours. True to her word, she burst into my hotel room 3 hours later like a whirlwind, carrying a laptop bag, a thermos of what smelled like dangerously strong coffee, and an air of competence that immediately made me feel safer. She took one look at the mess of takeout containers, the unmade bed, and my disheveled state. For a moment, the snarky PI disappeared, and she was just my little sister. She pulled me into a hug that was surprisingly strong. We're gonna figure this out, she said, her voice softer than I'd heard it in years. I promise. And for the first time in days, huddled in that cheap hotel room, I felt a tiny sliver of hope. Diane turned my hotel room into a makeshift command center. The air, which had been thick with my despair, now crackled with a new energy. It smelled of stale coffee and the low hum of her laptop. She was a force of nature, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her voice low and firm on the phone as she called in favors and accessed databases I didn't know existed. She was relentless. I mostly tried to stay out of her way, taking long, aimless walks, the monotonous scenery of the highway strip mall a strange backdrop to the unraveling of my life. On the fourth day, she came back late. She wasn't carrying coffee or takeout. She was carrying a thick manila folder, and she dropped it on the flimsy hotel desk with a heavy, final thud. Her face was grim, her eyes hard. "Sit down, Carol," she said. Her voice was flat, all business. "That's never what you want to hear." "That bad?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt a strange mix of terror and a desperate need to know. "Worse," she said, pulling a chair up. She opened the folder, and my life as I knew it ended right there on that cheap laminate desk. The first photo she slid across the table hit me like a punch to the gut. It was Gregory, my husband, walking out of the Marriott downtown, his hand resting possessively on the small of a woman's back. The woman was Brenda Vance. My partner. My friend. They weren't walking like colleagues. They were smiling, leaning into each other, walking like lovers who had just spent the afternoon in bed. "Son of a bitch," I whispered, the words like ash in my mouth. "It gets worse," Diane said, her voice devoid of any pity. She laid out more photos like she was dealing cards in the world's most crooked poker game. Greg and Brenda having an intimate lunch, her hand on his. Greg and Brenda kissing in his car in a deserted parking lot, the city lights blurry in the background. The date stamped on the photos went back 6 months. 6 months of lies, of secret lunches, of stolen afternoons while I was at the office, building a business I thought was ours. But it wasn't just about the affair. That was just the ugly, predictable part. The real horror came next. Diane pulled out another set of documents. Phone records, showing hundreds of calls between Greg and Brenda. And dozens more to a man named Leo Kane. "This guy, Leo Kane," Diane explained, tapping his smarmy, smiling photo, "is what you might call a life transition specialist. He's a bottom feeder who helps people disappear. New identities, fake passports, offshore accounts, the whole 9 yards." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a midlife crisis affair. This was a conspiracy. Then came the final, most devastating blow. Diane opened her laptop and showed me a cloud account she'd managed to hack. It was Greg's, under a fake name. It was full of pictures. Dozens and dozens of them, all taken with his phone. Pictures of my financial documents. My business contracts. My investment portfolios. My personal retirement account statements. Our life insurance policies. The deed to our house. Even the combination to our safe, which I'd foolishly written down and hidden in my desk drawer. He had been systematically photographing my entire financial life, from our joint assets to the college fund we had so carefully built for our daughter, Layla. He was creating an inventory of my life, all so he could steal it. "He wasn't just planning to leave you, Carol," Diane said, her voice low and furious, her hand resting on my arm. "He and Brenda were planning to drain your accounts, fake his death to throw everyone off the scent of a messy divorce, and disappear with every single penny you have. The mannequin, that was probably their insurance policy. If for some reason you came looking for him before he could get away, you'd find a body and assume the police were right. They wanted to leave you with nothing. Not just broke, but heartbroken and looking like a crazy, hysterical woman to the police." I stared at the evidence of their betrayal, the sheer, cold-blooded calculation of it all. Every "I love you," every shared meal, every moment of our life for the past year had been a performance. While I was working late to build our future, he was systematically planning my destruction. The man I had loved, the father of my child, had been plotting to erase me. I just sat there, in the silence of that soulless hotel room, the proof of my life's biggest lie spread out before me. My first instinct was pure, unadulterated rage. A white-hot fire that burned away the shock and grief, leaving something hard and sharp in its place. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive to Brenda's house and smash every window. My second instinct, the one the old, law-abiding Carol would have followed, was to call the police. To hand over this folder and watch them drag Greg and Brenda away in handcuffs. So, what now? I asked Diane, my voice surprisingly steady, eerily calm. Do I call Detective Wallace? Do I hire a divorce lawyer and fight a ghost? What's the protocol here? Diane leaned back in the uncomfortable hotel chair, studying my face. She saw the change in me, the fire in my eyes. She gave me a long, hard look. It was the look that meant she was about to suggest something that would either save my life or land me in federal prison. You could do that, she said slowly, choosing her words with care. You could be the good little Girl Scout. Turn over all this evidence to the cops. They'll open a fraud investigation. You'd go through a nightmare of a legal battle that would drag on for years. The publicity would probably destroy your business, because clients don't like that kind of drama. In the end, after spending a fortune on lawyer fees, you might get half of what's left of your money back. Greg and Brenda would do some time, probably not much, and you'd be left to pick up the pieces. She paused, letting the bleakness of that reality sink in. Then, a slow, predatory smile spread across her face, a look I hadn't seen since we were kids and she was planning to get back at a neighborhood bully. Or, she said, leaning forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You could let them think their plan is working, right up until the last second. You could let them walk right into the trap they built for you. And then you could take everything from them, just like they planned to do to you, only better. I stared at her. The idea was insane. It was dangerous. It was illegal. It was something the old Carol, the rule-following, trusting Carol, would have recoiled from in horror. But the old Carol was gone. She had died in that hotel room, surrounded by photographs of her husband's betrayal. In her place was someone else. Someone colder, harder, and angrier than I ever thought I could be. A slow smile matched my sister's. They started this game, I said, the words feeling powerful on my tongue. The least I can do is finish it. A look of fierce pride flashed in Diane's eyes. That's my sister, she said. And so, in that crappy hotel room, with the smell of stale coffee and betrayal hanging heavy in the air, we began to plot. We laid it all out on the cheap hotel stationery. It turns out that planning revenge is a lot like planning a business merger, except instead of maximizing profits, you're maximizing misery. The beauty of their plan was also its fatal flaw. It relied entirely on me being the same predictable, grieving, and slightly clueless woman I'd always been. They were about to find out they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. We weren't just going to stop their plan. We were going to hijack it. We were going to build a better, more ruthless trap using the very pieces they had laid out for us. They wanted to erase me. Fine. Let's see how they liked being erased instead. Our first move was to seize control of their exit strategy. That meant getting to Leo Kane, the slimy life transition specialist. Diane's deep dive into his background had turned up a beautiful little gem. Mr. Kane had some very creative accounting practices and owed the IRS a small fortune in back taxes and penalties. A carefully worded, anonymous tip to the right agent in the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division, Diane explained, could make a man very, very cooperative. Diane arranged a meeting at a grimy truck stop diner an hour out of town. The place smelled of burnt coffee and desperation. Leo Kane slid into the booth opposite us, looking exactly like the kind of man who sold fake IDs to college kids. He was nervous, his eyes darting around the room, constantly checking the door. Your clients, Gregory Pierce and Brenda Vance, are in a lot of trouble, Diane said, not bothering with pleasantries. She slid a folder across the sticky tabletop. It was mostly filled with blank paper, but the official-looking IRS logo on the top sheet was all that mattered. And they're about to drag you down with them. Or, you could help us, and your substantial tax problems might just get lost in the system. It didn't take much convincing. It's funny how quickly a man's loyalty shifts when he's staring at the possibility of a federal audit and jail time. Kane spilled everything. The accident was planned for the upcoming Saturday afternoon on Route 116, a curvy, dangerous stretch of road in the mountains. Greg was supposed to be driving to visit his fictitious sick aunt in Albany. After the fake crash, Greg would hike a mile to a secluded rendezvous point, where Kane would pick him up. From there, it was new identities and a one-way ticket to a life of leisure in Costa Rica, funded by my life's work. Not anymore, I said, my voice cold as ice. I slid him a new envelope, this one thick with cash, the first of many payments. Here's what's actually going to happen. Next, I needed a body for the faked crash. This was the trickiest part. That's where Shane Ward came in. Shane was former military, a tough, resourceful guy who owed me a big favor. A few years back, his security contractor business was about to go under, and I'd co-signed a business loan that kept him afloat. More importantly, Shane had a certain moral flexibility honed by years in special operations. I met him at a noisy sports bar, the kind of place where you can have a serious conversation without being overheard. When I laid out the plan, he just stared at me for a long moment, then let out a low whistle. "You want me to what now?" he'd asked, a hint of amused disbelief in his voice. "Play dead," I repeated calmly. "One car accident." Very convincing, very final. "We need the police to find a male body in the wreckage so the report is conclusive and they stop looking for Gregory." There was a pause as he took a long drink of his beer. Then, he looked me in the eye and gave a grim, approving nod. "Carol, this is the most messed up favor anyone's ever asked me for. I love it. When do we start?" While Diane and Shane handled the grisly theatrics, I turned my attention to home renovations. The basement had always been my domain. Greg hated going down there, claiming it was dark and creepy. Perfect. I spent the next 3 days working like a woman possessed. I ordered professional-grade soundproofing panels online for overnight delivery. I went to a specialty security store and bought a reinforced steel door with a commercial-grade keypad lock. I spent hours installing it, the drill whining in protest. I ran new plumbing lines myself, installing a small, functional toilet and sink in the corner. I furnished it with a simple bed, a table, and a chair from a thrift store. It was a subterranean bed and breakfast, where checkout time was entirely up to me. Every slam of the hammer, every turn of the wrench, felt like I was taking back a piece of my life, building my own justice with my own 2 hands. Saturday morning arrived again, 1 week after my life had been torn apart. This time, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a mocking contrast to the dark events about to unfold. I spent the morning in the garage, a perfect alibi. But this time, I wasn't fixing the car. I was just sitting in it, waiting, my nerves stretched as thin as a guitar string. Every passing car made me jump. At 1 p.m., I went inside and called my daughter, Layla, at college. It was the hardest phone call of my life. I had to tell her that her father was dead. Her cry of anguish on the other end of the line was a real, physical pain in my chest. It was a cruel necessity, a horrible part of the charade, and the guilt of it nearly broke me. But I held it together, my voice choked with the grief I was supposed to be feeling. The official call from the police came at 2:47 p.m. It was a different officer this time, his voice appropriately somber as he delivered the news I'd been expecting. This time, I played my part perfectly. I let out the choked sob I had been rehearsing in my head. I dropped the phone, letting it clatter to the floor for dramatic effect. I rushed to the hospital, demanding to see the body, my voice frantic with staged grief. When a kind-faced doctor gently told me the remains were too badly damaged for a viewing due to the fire, I collapsed into a chair, burying my face in my hands. It was the performance of a lifetime. Shane had done his job beautifully. The crash on Route 116 looked absolutely convincing. He'd even sustained a few real bruises and a minor concussion to make it look authentic. He'd made sure some of Greg's personal effects, a watch I'd given him for our 15th anniversary, his favorite sunglasses, were scattered around the wreckage. We'd even procured dental records from a John Doe that were a close enough match to pass any initial inspection. Gregory Pierce was, for all official purposes, dead and gone. The funeral was held on Thursday. It was a closed casket service, naturally. I stood by the grave, dressed in black, accepting condolences from tearful friends and family. Brenda was there, of course, her face a perfect mask of sorrow. She hugged me tightly, whispering, "I'm so sorry, Carol. We'll get through this together." I felt a murderous rage boil up inside me, but I just nodded numbly, playing the part of the shattered widow. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Meanwhile, about 30 miles away from the staged accident, the real main event had taken place. Leo Kane had met Greg at the rendezvous point. He'd offered Greg a bottle of water to calm his nerves. The water was laced with a powerful sedative Shane had provided. By the time my dear husband woke up, he was no longer on his way to a tropical paradise. He was in his new home, my custom-built, soundproofed basement suite. The plan had worked. He had vanished. He was officially dead to the world, exactly as he'd planned. The only difference was that his new world was a 10 by 12-foot room beneath the house where he'd spent 22 years lying to me. Gregory woke up around 6 in the evening. I'd been monitoring him through the discreet security cameras I'd installed, watching him sleep with the kind of peaceful expression he hadn't worn around me in months. It was the peacefulness of a man who believes he has successfully committed the perfect crime. The first thing he did when his eyes fluttered open was call out a name, a single word that twisted the knife in my heart one more time: Brenda? Not for me, his wife of 22 years, but for his accomplice, his new life. Well, honey, that future just got a serious, permanent revision. When he finally sat up, the potent sedative still making his movements sluggish, and took in his surroundings, the confusion on his face was a thing of beauty. This clearly wasn't the 5-star Costa Rican resort he'd been expecting. Instead of an ocean view and a king-sized bed, he found himself in a windowless room with polished concrete walls and tasteful, if Spartan, furnishings. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice raspy. He struggled to his feet and stumbled toward the solid steel door, rattling the handle uselessly. Panic began to dawn in his eyes. I let him marinate in that rising terror for a few more minutes. I'd waited a long, painful year for this moment. I intended to savor it. Then, I leaned into the microphone on my desk and activated the intercom system. "Good evening, Gregory," I said, my voice echoing through the speakers in his room with perfect, chilling clarity. "I hope you slept well. You'll want to be rested." His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief as they darted around the room, finally settling on the dark lens of the camera in the corner. "Carol?" His voice cracked, a mixture of confusion and dawning fear. "Carol, what is this? Where am I? What's going on?" "You're exactly where you wanted to be, sweetheart," I replied, my voice dangerously sweet. I settled back in my office chair upstairs, feeling like a film director at a private screening of my masterpiece. Dead to the world. Starting fresh. Congratulations, you got everything you asked for. I clicked a button on my console, and the small TV screen I'd mounted on his wall flickered to life. It was the local news, and they were showing his face. He watched, his mouth agape in horror, as the news anchor described the tragic, fiery crash that had claimed the life of a beloved local businessman. They showed footage of the mangled car being hauled onto a flatbed truck. In other news, I continued conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather. "Your funeral was yesterday. Very moving. Layla gave a beautiful eulogy. You would have been so proud." I went with the closed casket option, given the condition of the body. Very tasteful service, though. Brenda cried the whole time. A truly convincing performance. This is insane, he stammered, backing away from the TV, pressing himself against the cold concrete wall. You can't keep me here. Brenda will look for me. Brenda will. Brenda will what? I interrupted, my voice turning sharp. Brenda thinks you're dead. Remember? That was the plan. Your plan. I switched the feed on his screen. Now, he was watching a live view from a tiny camera Diane had planted in a flower pot outside Brenda's expensive apartment building. And there she was, pacing back and forth in her living room, her face a mask of frantic panic. Take a good look, Greg, I said, zooming in on her face. That's the woman you chose over me. Watch how deeply concerned she is about your well-being. He watched as Brenda, unable to reach him or Kane, started making different calls. Not to hospitals. Not to the police. She was calling her lawyer. Her accountant. Her offshore banker. She wasn't worried about him, she was worried about the money. She was worried about saving her own skin. I let him watch for a full 10 minutes as she worked the phones, her panic escalating. The truth was hitting him like a series of physical blows. I could see it in his face, the gradual, horrifying understanding that he'd been a pawn. Brenda hadn't loved him, she'd used him as a key to unlock my assets. And now that the key was lost, she was just trying to burn the whole damn house down to cover her tracks. His brilliant escape plan had turned into his own private hell, and he was the only one in it. While Gregory was getting acquainted with the four walls of his new reality, Diane and I moved on to the next phase of the plan, Brenda. The beauty of having a sister who's a PI is that they know all sorts of interesting people, including a couple of out-of-work actors who were very convincing as stern, humorless federal agents. On Monday morning, I went into the office we shared, playing the part of the grieving, fragile widow. It wasn't hard to look exhausted, I hadn't slept in days. Brenda showed up looking just as haggard, though I suspected her reasons were quite different. She wrapped me in a hug that felt like being held by a cold, clammy snake. Carol, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy that made my skin crawl. I'm so sorry. I can't believe he's gone. But don't worry, we'll get through this together. The hypocrisy was so thick you could cut it with a knife. That afternoon, while Brenda was out for a long lunch, undoubtedly with her lawyer, the first domino fell. Our two federal agents strode into our office, all business suits and serious expressions. They flashed impressive-looking, and completely fake, badges at our receptionist and announced, loud enough for half the office to hear, that they had some questions for Ms. Brenda Vance regarding financial irregularities and questionable offshore accounts. They left behind a very official-looking, and very fake, subpoena on her desk. When Brenda returned, the office was buzzing with hushed whispers. I watched through my office window as she read the subpoena, her face going through about 6 different shades of pale before settling on a sickly green. She was in my office within minutes, closing the door behind her and trying to look casual while her entire world was visibly crumbling. Carol, she said, her voice trembling slightly, there might be some complications with some of my personal investments. It's probably just a misunderstanding. The sweat beading on her forehead suggested it was much more than that. That evening, I gave Greg a front-row seat to his girlfriend's meltdown. I switched his monitor back to the live feed of Brenda's apartment. She was on the phone again, but this time she was desperately trying to reach Leo Kane, begging for an emergency extraction. I need new papers, tonight, she was saying, her voice high and shrill with panic. The whole thing's blown up. There are federal agents asking questions, and I need to be gone before they connect me to those offshore accounts. Greg just stared at the screen, his face a white, emotionless mask. This was the woman he had destroyed our marriage for. A coward, ready to abandon him and their plan the second things got difficult. The beautiful thing about fake investigations is that sometimes, when you shake a tree hard enough, real crimes fall out. Panicked and believing the feds were closing in, Brenda started moving money. Illegally. She tried to transfer a large sum from a corporate account she controlled into one of her secret offshore accounts, a clear act of embezzlement. What she didn't know was that Diane, anticipating this, had already flagged those accounts with a contact at the Treasury Department. Her frantic, illegal transfer set off every real alarm bell from here to Washington, D.C. She had just walked right into a very real federal trap. On Wednesday morning, 3 black SUVs from the actual FBI pulled into our office parking lot. This time, it wasn't actors. This was the real deal. I watched from my window as real agents, armed with a real arrest warrant, marched into our office. Brenda took one look at them and tried to run. She actually bolted for the back exit, clutching her expensive purse. They had her in cuffs before she made it 10 feet. I forced Greg to watch every second of it on the news that night. The perp walk in front of the cameras, the reporters shouting questions, the grim-faced U.S. attorney announcing the charges: wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and money laundering. The anchor said she was facing up to 25 years in a federal prison. I sat in my office chair upstairs, watching my husband on the monitor as he watched his lover's life end on the television in his concrete room. I saw the last flicker of hope die in his eyes. He had lost. She had lost. And I had won. I let that moment hang in the air, the silence in his room broken only by the sound of the news anchor detailing Brenda's crimes. I let him absorb the totality of his failure, the complete and utter destruction of the life he tried to steal from me. I stood there, watching my husband watch his lover's life end, and I felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't loud or angry. It was just the calm, steady feeling of balance being restored to the universe. If you're still listening, please do me a favor and like this video, and comment the number 1 below. It lets me know you've given me a like, and it tells me you're right here with me on this journey. Your support means the world and encourages me to keep going. Please, comment the number 1, and let me tell you what happened next. For 2 weeks, I let him sit with it. 2 weeks of solitary confinement with nothing but his own guilt, his own failure, and the 24/7 news cycle detailing Brenda's spectacular downfall for company. She, of course, was trying to cut a deal, singing like a canary and trying to blame everything on her dead lover, Gregory. The irony was a bitter pill he had to swallow every single day. Finally, the request came through the intercom. His voice was no longer arrogant or panicked, it was just a rough, broken whisper. "Carol, please. I need to see you. I need to talk to you. Face to face." I made him wait another hour, just to be sure he understood who was in control. When I finally opened the heavy steel door and stepped into his little apartment, the change in him was shocking. He looked like a ghost. He'd lost at least 20 pounds, his clothes hanging off his frame. His eyes were hollow, defeated. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands folded in his lap like a child waiting to be scolded. I pulled up the simple wooden chair I'd placed there and sat down opposite him. The silence stretched on for a long moment. "Why?" he finally whispered, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. "Why go to all this trouble? A divorce, you could have just filed for divorce. You would have gotten everything in court. You could have destroyed me." It was a fair question. And I'd had 2 long, quiet weeks to think about the answer. "Because divorce would have been civilized," I said, my voice steady and even. "Divorce would have implied that we were 2 reasonable adults who'd simply grown apart, who could shake hands and split our assets. But that's not what happened, is it, Greg? You didn't just want to leave me. You wanted to erase me. You wanted to take my money, my business, my future, and leave me with nothing but a fake death certificate and the suspicion of the police. You didn't want a divorce, Gregory, you wanted a funeral. My funeral. You just wanted me to be the only one attending." He started to cry then. Not the dramatic, self-pitying sobs I'd expected, but the ugly, shuddering sobs of a man who has been completely broken. "I'm sorry," he choked out between breaths. "I'm so sorry, Carol. I made a mistake." "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk from the store," I said, my voice cold as ice. "This was a conspiracy. A betrayal. Now, here's what's going to happen. I leaned forward, forcing him to meet my eyes. You have a choice. Option 1, you stay here. Permanently. You'll be safe, you'll be fed, and you will be completely erased from the world above. You will live out your days in this room. His eyes widened in horror. Carol, you can't. Option 2, I continued, cutting him off. I help you disappear. For real. A new identity, a new background, enough cash to start over somewhere no one will ever find you. You get to have a life. But you lose everything from your old one. Your name, your history, your friends, your family. I let the last word hang in the air, twisting like a knife. Your daughter. The mention of our daughter, Layla, hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, a sound of pure pain escaping his lips. Layla, our beautiful, smart, 19-year-old daughter. As far as she knew, her beloved father had died tragically in a car accident. She was grieving. And he was the cause of that grief. Layla, he whispered, the name a prayer. My baby girl. How is she? She's heartbroken, I said, the words sharp and true. But she's strong. She's stronger than you ever gave her credit for. If you choose option 2, I said, pressing my final, brutal advantage, if you agree to disappear and never, ever try to contact either of us again, I'll make sure you get pictures. Updates on how she's doing. Major milestones, her graduation, maybe her wedding one day. Not often. But enough for you to know that she's happy. It wasn't really a choice at all. It was a choice between a physical prison and an emotional one. A choice between two different kinds of hell, one of which offered a tiny, excruciating window into the heaven he had lost. He looked up at me, his eyes full of 22 years of shared history, now twisted and warped into this ugly, tragic end. I want to see my daughter grow up, he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. Even if it's just in pictures. Then it's settled, I said, standing to leave. The conversation was over. Tomorrow, you become someone else. And Gregory Pierce stays buried where he belongs. 3 months after Gregory Pierce was officially buried in Greenwood Cemetery, a quiet, unassuming man named Gary Hayes walked into a hardware store in a small, forgotten town in rural Idaho. He had a completely fabricated resume, a believable story about starting over after a messy divorce, and the haunted look of a man who had lost everything. The owner, a gruff old guy who'd been through a bad divorce himself, gave him a job managing inventory without asking too many questions. Gary was quiet, modest, and kept to himself. He lived in a small apartment above the store and became the kind of person who could disappear into the background of small-town America without leaving so much as a ripple. Meanwhile, back in my actual life, things began to flourish in a way they hadn't in years. With Brenda in prison and her name scrubbed from the letterhead, our firm, now just Pierce Consulting, thrived. It turns out, being the innocent, grieving widow of one partner and the betrayed victim of another makes you look incredibly trustworthy and competent by comparison. Clients flocked to us. The insurance payout from Greg's death, $250,000, went straight into a trust fund for Layla's future education and first home. And Layla, my beautiful Layla, was thriving. The grief she felt for the father she thought she'd lost had forged a new kind of strength in her. She threw herself into her studies, and our weekly phone calls became the highlight of my week, filled with a depth and honesty we hadn't shared in years. Every fourth Saturday, I drove to a post office box in a town 50 miles away and mailed a plain manila envelope to a P.O. box in Idaho. Inside were photographs. Layla smiling as she made the dean's list. Layla laughing with friends on a ski trip. Layla, vibrant and happy and growing into an incredible young woman. There were never any letters, never any notes. Just the photos. Just proof that his sacrifice, in a way, hadn't been meaningless. It was a small cruelty wrapped in a sliver of mercy. 5 years passed. 5 years of me building something better from the ashes. 5 years of Gary Hayes living his invisible life of exile. And 5 years of Layla growing into a woman I admired more than anyone on earth. The day was perfect, one of those crisp May afternoons that feel like a new beginning. I was sitting in the packed auditorium of her university, my heart swelling with a pride so intense it almost hurt, watching my daughter walk across the stage to receive her engineering degree, summa cum laude. As I scanned the crowd of happy, beaming families, my blood suddenly turned to ice. There, in the dim light of the back row, wearing a baseball cap pulled low and oversized sunglasses, was a man I'd have recognized anywhere. Thinner, older, with more gray at his temples, but unmistakably him. He had broken the cardinal rule. He had come back. For a moment, pure, cold fear shot through me. What if he tried to approach her? What if he destroyed the peace we'd so carefully, so painfully, built? I watched him as he watched our daughter, and even from across the cavernous room, I could see the silent tears streaming down his face. He raised a small, cheap disposable camera and took a few pictures, a ghost documenting a life he could never be a part of. Part of me, the angry, vengeful part, wanted to call security. To have him dragged out, exposed, his new life obliterated. But another part, a part one didn't much like but couldn't deny, understood. This was his daughter, too. This was a moment he had traveled 1,000 miles and risked everything he had left just to witness. So, I made a choice. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to move, our eyes met across the auditorium. He froze, sheer terror flashing across his face. He thought he was caught. I could have destroyed him with a single word, a single gesture. Instead, I nodded. Just once. A tiny, almost imperceptible gesture. It was an acknowledgement. An act of mercy. And the final, ultimate act of control. The look of pure, shocked gratitude that crossed his face was worth more than any punishment I could have ever inflicted. He understood. I was still the one making the rules. He mouthed 2 words I could read even from that distance, "Thank you." Then he turned and melted into the crowd, disappearing forever. Later, as I hugged Layla, the scent of her perfume filling my senses, she said, "I wish Dad could have been here. He would have been so proud." He would have, I agreed, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. And for the first time in 5 years, I truly meant it. Justice, I've learned, isn't always about loud, fiery revenge. Sometimes, the most perfect revenge is simply living well, while your enemies are forced to live, every single day, with the consequences of their choices. I had my daughter, my business, my future. He had a handful of blurry photographs and a life lived in the shadows. The scales had finally settled, exactly where they belonged. Thank you all for listening to my story. It means a lot to be able to share it. If you have any thoughts, or if you've been through something that taught you about your own strength, I'd love to read about it in the comments below. Take care of yourselves, and each other.